part of our survival, you know, as a species, has been based upon our ability to recognize patterns. And so, what addiction did for me was it numbed my ability to recognize negative patterns. You know,
Sure.
it took me out of a place where normally, if I'm not intoxicated, I can recognize these unhealthy patterns in my life and stop them. Right. If I had a pattern or a habit, if you will, of like stabbing myself in the leg every day, sober, I would identify that pattern quickly, but and eliminate it. However, unfortunately, like the addiction part of the pattern was so subtle and it's so reoccurring that it took me a really long time to recognize that I would get into those situations. I would promise myself something. The next day, a feeling would come up. I wouldn't like that feeling. I would forget that I had made the promise to
Right.
myself the night before,
Right.
or it would become 5 o'clock and yesterday wasn't quite as bad, you know. And that was kind of a pattern for me. Was I would go out into my addiction. I would use and I would drink. I would harm myself and others. I would unfortunately not black out, so I had to remember that what I did the night before. The next day, I would make the promise that today I'm not going to indulge in that behavior, thus not drinking, just going to smoke weed, whatever, you know, like you're
Right.
talking about. My day would progress. I would start feeling a little bit better. You know, the alcohol poisoning would start wearing off. I
Right.
would start forgetting that, you know, it wasn't that they kind of deserved it or whatever the excuse may be. I slowly start talking myself back into, you know, the fear of not drinking. Like, what am I going to eat? That would crop up. And then I would eventually get to the point where, okay, it's time for a drink. It's 5 o'clock or whatever the excuse was. And as soon as I put one in, everything was out, you know, all bets were off and it was
Right.
time to indulge. And then the same thing I did the night before would happen that night. Exact same thing. The harm, the self abuse, the alcohol poisoning, the drug addiction, the unsafe sex, the violence, all the things that came along with it the night before that made me not want to do that the night of
Right.
would come back that night. And the next morning, gosh, that's, you know, 2 years in a row I've been doing this. And the pattern would continue. And that's basically for me what I think of when I think of patterns is, you know, something reoccurring over and over and over
Right.
and over and over happening in, you know, into infinity. But luckily I am a pattern recognizing machine, and there were some patterns that I didn't like and thus asked for help
Right.
with. So
And is that the way that you've been able to sort of get out of those loops or break those patterns is by asking for help and
Yeah.
also being open to doing the work?
yeah, getting honest about the fact that there is a pattern there. I don't know how it works, right? Like I don't know how I was able to be put into recovery situation. You know, if you're watching this podcast or listening to this podcast, you're like I am. You've
Right.
been put into a position to hear a message, and that's what happened with me. Was I was put into a position to hear a message, and as I listened to that, and people would tell their stories, I could recognize in myself those same things that were going on with that person, and I stuck it out long enough now that yeah, you know. So in early sobriety, there was definitely a pattern of negativity and self doubt, right? And so yes, asking for help with negativity and self doubt helped me get out of those patterns. You know, I thought early on that if I could just quit drinking, if I could just quit using, then everything would straighten out. But it wasn't enough, you know, because the negative thoughts and the the self-harm, emotional self-harm continued, you know, because of the negative self-talk.
Right.
That stuff continued. And so the pattern of self-harm didn't quit just because I got sober.
Right.
You know, it took work and it took help.